Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. All right, so welcome back, everyone. We've got a special treat for you because for all you Dahmies out there, we've got Mitchell's favorite China military expert, Mike Dahm, or JDAM as we call him here. He's going to tell us about his recent trip to Taiwan and what he learned about the island, its people, and their ability to defend Taiwan and show resilience in the face of Chinese military coercion. JDAM, it's great to have you back on the podcast.
I'm never really comfortable with your Dahmy comparison to Swifties, but I guess I'll take whatever praise I can get.
All right, so JDAM, you visited Taiwan over the winter break, and it wasn't really just a vacation. But what was your business like? What were you doing there?
Yeah, so I am an adjunct lecturer at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. I co-teach a class there on China's military, on the People's Liberation Army, or PLA. And George Washington University and the Elliott School gave us an opportunity to lead a short-term abroad program, what they call a STAP, short-term abroad program, on Taiwan resilience under military coercion. And I really can't take credit for putting the course together. It was put together by my good friend, Professor Dan Peck. He was the brains behind the operation. I just tried to keep the trains running on time. It was really popular. We had over 20 students on the course, plus myself and Dan and a teaching assistant. And so it was like trying to move 23 people around a foreign country in trains, vans,
planes and automobiles,
metros, and it was just hurting. Yeah, we actually had a boat. We went on a harbor tour down in Kaohsiung. But that took up the first week of January, and Mitchell was kind enough to let me go. And I learned a lot, and I just wanted to come back and talk to you about some of the things that I found out when I was there.
So tour guide, chaperone, all the good things, right? These are your side hustles.
Exactly.
No, we were glad to have you there because, being able to go over to Taiwan and visit with the people, the professional engagements that you had while you were there, it's crucial to, frankly, to your perspective as a military expert on the PLA.
Yeah, and I mean, while I was there, I did get to meet the Taiwan foreign minister. He says hi, by the way. I don't know if you know, but I'm kind of a big deal in Taiwan.
JDAM, you're a big deal everywhere.
Okay, so actually we were just standing in the lobby at the presidential palace waiting for our meeting with someone else, and the Taiwan foreign minister did come through, and he was like, "Hey, who are these Americans in my lobby?" So he introduced himself. We exchanged business cards, but that was about it.
Okay, so when you showed up, the Chinese were having a big military exercise where the PLA established closure areas around Taiwan, and they conducted operations. And that was like, the 29th and 30th of December. Yep. So did that interfere with your arrival?
Well, I thought it was going to because I flew into Taipei on the 30th, and it's a 14-hour flight from San Francisco where I connected. And I thought, this is, the closure areas are happening right in the middle of my flight. So is United going to
to divert?
Are they going to take off and just kind of wait and see what happens with the exercise and the closure areas? Are they going to just hope for the best and hope that since we're landing after the closure area ends? It was a non-event.
Really?
There were plenty of international flights going into Taipei. Very few of them were affected in any way, shape, or form. If you looked at where the closure areas were, if you were coming from Japan or coming from the West Coast of the United States, there was nothing really in the way. And this has just kind of become routine now.
Closure areas, does the PLA actually have the authority to close off that airspace? It's over international waters.
It's over international waters, so the closure areas are advisory in nature.
All right. So it's kind of like our whiskey areas.
Exactly. So you would have thought that it was, and it did create some disruptions. There are flight routes that go through the Taiwan Strait. There are lots of commercial flights that go between Taiwan and some of their they call them outer islands, or these are the little Taiwan islands along the coast of China, Taiwan-held islands along the coast of China. So all of those flights were canceled. There were a bunch of Coast Guard and PLA Coast Guard or PLA Navy and China Coast Guard ships that were arrayed around the island. But it was really interesting. We talked to a scholar a professor at one of the universities there, and he observed that the reason these PLA exercises, and there have been several since Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, visited Taiwan in August of 2022. He says, yeah, there's a reason why these are just like 2 or maybe 3-day exercises. And it's because of the economic impact of disrupting cross-strait trade between the mainland and Taiwan. You know, shipping was not really impacted by these exercises. The commercial ships just steer around the closure areas and make their way into Taiwan ports. There are gaps between the closure areas that they can navigate. But the PLA is according to this scholar, the PLA has been told, you know, you got to limit these demonstrations to 1 or 2 days because otherwise the economic pain level is
cause complaints.
It's going to cause complaints, and you don't want to get sideways with the economic forces at play, either on the mainland or in Taiwan. But I think this is now the 5th or 6th demonstration since that Speaker Pelosi visit in 2022. There was joint sword in 2023 and there were 3 instances of what they called joint sword, and then the Eastern Theater commander started getting more creative with the titles. So in early 2025 in April, they had Straight Thunder 2025A, and then this one was Justice Mission. Who came up with that name? Justice Mission 2025 probably sounds better with music under it, but December 2025, Justice Mission 2025 was really out of cycle.
I can't imagine that would be the weather conditions that they would want to do any kind of invasion. So what do you think this was demonstrating?
I think it's demonstrating that the PLA can operate outside of their normal training cycle. And there's also been, especially since 2022, something the Chinese are calling a cold start military posture.
What's that mean?
Well, so they want to be able to achieve rapid, high-intensity offensive actions before an adversary, whether it's the U.S., Taiwan, Japan, or anybody else, can react. And some of this is out of, just kind of the normal progression of Chinese military capabilities. They started focusing on it in 2017, 2018. But after they were surprised by Speaker Pelosi's visit, they really wanted this capability to be able to respond quickly and strongly to anything that presented itself in the future. So they were probably preparing for
this exercise
for Justice Mission weeks ago, but they announced it like the morning of the exercise, and Taiwan was like, "Wait, what?" Like, we usually get several days notice about this, and they were getting notified that morning that there were going to be these closure areas that day. So at least it appeared as if the PLA was,
responding rapidly or
responding rapidly to this. Some say it's because of the announcement of U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But whatever the case, the Chinese are trying to present themselves as being able to respond quickly in a contingency and deliver a decisive blow.
So they can do it year-round. They don't have to build up to a critical mass where then they can conduct combat operations. They're basically anytime, anywhere.
Yeah. Anytime, any place.
There you go. So New Year's Eve, Taipei. How was that?
Yeah, slept right through it. Some of the students that were on the trip came early as well because the program didn't actually start until the 2nd. And so some of the students got to go down to Taipei 101, which is the tallest building in Taipei. It used to be the tallest building in the world for several years until the United Arab Emirates started building towers. But it's apparently quite the event where it's sort of like Times Square and everybody goes down there and then they launch these fireworks off of 101, Taipei 101. But it was raining and I was jet lagged and I'm old, so that happened.
Yeah, I celebrated New Year's Eve. I think at GMT time was.
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, it's Greenwich Mean Time. That's like when we should all be celebrating.
Exactly. Yeah. So give us the lay of the land. And a quick description of the tour, like who you visited, when, where, all the good stuff.
Yeah, so flew into Taipei, had a couple of days in Taipei, had some great offline meetings with some Taiwan military folks and some folks who were working with the National Security Council. And I'll talk a little bit about those meetings
Yeah,
and some of the things
what'd you learn there?
some of the things that we learned as we were talking to them. But just lay of the land, we started out in Taipei, sort of got everybody oriented, took the high-speed rail. So Taipei is up in the north, if anybody doesn't know how Taiwan is laid out. Taiwan, mostly mountains. And I don't think people really appreciate just how big these mountains are. But 13,000 feet is this mountain range that runs along the west side of the island.
Which is pretty spectacular when you think about going from sea level to 13,000 feet. Like if you're going to go skiing in Aspen, like you fly into Denver, you're already 6,000 feet up. So the difference is only another 7 to 8,000
so the Rockies are like 14,000 feet. So this is like
But you're starting at sea level in Taipei.
Exactly. And it goes up to 13,000 feet, and that pretty much dominates the east side of the island. So all of the population and all of these landing beaches that we talk about, like all of that is on the west side of the island. So we start out in the northwest corner in Taipei. We take the high-speed rail down to Kaohsiung, which is the largest port in Taiwan, and it's down in the southwest corner. And Kaohsiung's a great town, and we spent some time there. We went on a harbor tour. I can talk a little bit more about that. Then, and this was one of the most interesting parts of the trip, we took a small plane and flew out to Jinmen, which is a small island that's right off the coast of China. It's only about 5 miles from the Chinese coast near the Chinese city of Xiamen.
You can see each other from that range.
And I have been to Xiamen, and I have looked across the water to Jinmen, but this was my first opportunity to go to Jinmen and look the other way to the Chinese coast. And so we just spent one night in Jinmen and had a great tour there, and then we flew back to Taipei. And we had a bunch of meetings with think tanks and universities and had a lot of great engagements there back in Taipei before we flew back here on the 10th.
So it's really great that you got to visit all of these different locations around Taiwan. And, visiting Jinmen is going to be really interesting to hear about. We talk a lot about China and the PLA, but I don't know that we talk enough about their objective and the nuts and bolts of how they might use military power to force Taiwan's surrender. Because it's one thing to look at maps and pictures and imagine a PLA invasion of the island. We talk about the joke all the time, but we usually do it in really big pictures. But the nuts and bolts, like how you actually do that, it's something else to stand on the hill and look down on that potential landing beach.
Yeah, no, that was great for me. It was great for the students. The JILC, the Joint Island Landing Campaign, is something that we study in the course that I teach on China's military. It's sort of the last weeks of the course after we talked about all the capabilities. It's like, well, how would they employ it? And this course was really about where would they employ it, and what are the things that Taiwan could do to put up a fight, to put up resistance, to put up a defense of the thing that the PLA covets, the thing that the PLA might want to conquer. And so, yeah, standing on that terrain and seeing and hiking up some of that terrain was super interesting and very valuable kind of to get hands on that.
Because there's limited landing sites for them.
Well, exactly. So we started out going up to a place called Keelung, which is north of Taipei, and there are some small beaches that could be used for landings there. There's a small port there that could be captured. But the thing that you immediately take away from that is half an hour to 40 minutes to drive from central Taipei to Keelung. You've got to go through mountains. You've got to go through tunnels. You've got to go through these, small areas where
that are going to funnel forces in, make you a prime target. It's
intersecting fields of
slow
fire.
Your advance.
Exactly. I mean, whether you're bringing in close air support or helicopter gunships or drones or artillery, mortars, whatever it is, it's going to be real hard to move through that terrain. It's not enough that you can capture the port or you can land on the beach. You have to be able to get to.
You have to be able to move your forces inland.
You have to be able to move your forces inland, and that's always been one of the constraints on an amphibious landing in Taiwan. Even if you can get ashore, in order to get to something substantial, in order to get to something meaningful. And then you go up to the top of Taipei 101. It has this 360-degree observation deck. You get these sweeping views of the city. But I remember I was up there once with a former Marine, and he's mumbling something to himself, and I'm like, what are you saying? And he says, cities eat armies. And from 101 Taipei, which is right in the middle of the city, you look out and it's just these mountains. It's kind of in a bowl, but it is urban terrain as far as the eyes can see, right? So if you're moving a military force into Taipei, you have to protect your rear. You have to start dropping off soldiers along the way. And that's what he meant.
Doing that occupation.
That's what he meant by cities eat armies. As you move 100,000 guys into the city and you're dropping off battalions and companies along the way, well, by the time you arrive at your objective, you've got like 10,000 guys left, right? Because you've had to drop 90,000.
Yeah, depending on how many you're able to get in, right? Because you got to be able to feed the fight. And there's a limit to how many boats they can land, offload, move out of the way for the next boat to come in. So you begin to bottle these guys up there at the top, and then funnel them through. So there are a number of constraints, points in the pipe that really stop you from being able to feed your forces to be able to flow through.
Yeah, and
Taipei.
so where the big landing beaches are, the place where you could get a substantial beachhead and bring lots of forces in, those are all down south. Like everything up north is relatively small, not even as much frontage as, National Airport has here in Washington, D.C. on the Potomac River. Very small constrained areas that, again, immediately go up into this challenging terrain. Well, down south, there are these bigger beaches, things that you would think of.
Actual ports.
Yeah, it doesn't look like, well, they've got big ports, to be sure, but they also have big sandy beaches, maybe not like Normandy or the beaches out in Delaware that are nearby here in Washington, D.C., but certainly something where you could land a substantial force and establish a large beachhead. Well, it took us 90 minutes going over 300 miles an hour on the high-speed rail to get from Taipei down to Kaohsiung. Now imagine your landing force and your hundreds of thousands of men and equipment. You now have to move up the coast to get to the capital.
And what's that terrain like?
So it's a lot of rice paddies. It's a lot of water features and things. But again, mountains and bridges and tunnels and all things that you would have to get through to get from point A to point B. And I don't want to get too much into the nuts and bolts of the landing, but there's a strategy in which the Chinese military sort of tries to leapfrog up the coast, which is to say you do a big landing in the south and then you do a bunch of small landings and just kind of leapfrog up the coast so that you don't have to deal with the terrain.
Actual geography.
But that opens you up to counterattack. It's going to be hard enough going overland up the coast, and you've got the problem of fuel and logistics lines and protecting all of those things. But if you're operating from sea bases or from a beachhead where you're then leapfrogging up the coast, that comes with its own hazards and the potential for attack by air, attack by sea, attack using unmanned surface vessels or unmanned underwater vessels, sea mines, all of those things. I think the big takeaway is, and the Allies knew this in the Second World War, right? There was this whole plan called Operation Causeway to invade Taiwan, what they were then calling Formosa. The Japanese were occupying Taiwan. They had air bases on Taiwan. And the Allies were, of course, trying to work their way from their island hopping campaign ultimately to the main islands of Japan. So the question before the Joint Staff was, do you invade Formosa and do you knock the Japanese off of Taiwan, or do you just bypass it, as we had done with many difficult things in the Pacific, and go on to Okinawa? And only Fleet Admiral King, who was the chief of naval operations at the time, only Fleet Admiral King was in favor of going after Taiwan. MacArthur, Nimitz, the rest of the chiefs thought it was just too difficult, just too difficult to go after Taiwan because the terrain was so challenging that an amphibious invasion would eat up all of these resources, all of these troops and equipment.
That frankly you needed for Okinawa, right?
And so ultimately they just decided to bypass it and go to Okinawa. So the big takeaway is Taiwan is not an easy target. It's very difficult terrain. It favors the defender. yeah, the PLA is big, yeah, the PLA is bad, yeah, the PLA has all of these capabilities. But I think the PLA knows, just from history and their own examination of the tactical realities
Of the geography.
and the geography and the topography, it's just not going to be easy. So having the opportunity to walk that terrain, to walk on those beaches, to turn around, putting your back to the water and looking up at what you would have to deal with if you were a landing force just gives you a lot of perspective on how difficult an amphibious landing would be. And I think a lot of times in the popular press, we're just like, well, if they can get all their forces on ships and they have air and maritime superiority, it's going to be a walk in the park. And it is far from that.
PenFed checking and savings accounts are here for all your adventures. From
Do you take this man to be your husband?
I do.
to
He has your eyes.
He's perfect.
learn more at penfed.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up Operation Causeway, because I don't know how many of our listeners are familiar with Taiwan's military history or Formosa's history. So what did you learn and experience on your trip? What should our listeners take away?
So there's a lot of history, certainly, that we focused on in the course. I won't go over all of it here. But again, the subject of the course was about Taiwan's ability to resist under military coercion. And there are lots of examples of military coercion that has happened in the past. And lo and behold, Taiwan has resisted. The better example, I think, from history in terms of resisting military coercion were two events that happened on Jinmen. And this is why the visit to Jinmen was, I think, really interesting for the students and for me, having never been there myself. So not only do I get to see Xiamen from the other side and stand on these beaches that still have landing defenses up, right? The big steel and concrete spikes.
Barriers and spikes.
And barriers and things that are on the beach there. The first example of Taiwan's ability to resist an invasion came from the 1949 Battle of Guningtou. And we went to a museum there. It's a source of Taiwan pride and really a source of PLA humiliation. So it's 1949. And the nationalists, right? The nationalists were fighting in a civil war with the communists. The communists were winning. So the nationalists, which we call the Kuomintang or the KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek, are retreating to Taiwan. But they decide to make a stand on this little island of Jinmen, which again, is just a few miles off the coast of China. And the PLA thinks this is going to be a walk in the park. We're going to take Jinmen and then on to Taiwan. But Chiang Kai-shek decides the KMT is going to make a stand on Jinmen. So it's 1949. The PLA launches this amphibious invasion of this little island, and it's supposed to be over in 3 days. Now, how many times have we heard this, right? Like, Kyiv is going to fall in 3 days. Milosevic is going to give up in Yugoslavia in 3 days. It's all going to end in 3 days. 3 days is a magic number, apparently.
But we always underestimate how long it takes for military operations.
Exactly. And the PLA did the same thing, and they made some huge tactical errors. They didn't read the tides right. They thought this was going to be a quick victory. And what ends up happening is the KMT makes its stand, the nationalists make their stand, and the boats that they land with, the tide goes out and the boats are stuck. They can't retreat. They have to fight in place. They're stuck on the beach. The KMT mows them down and burns their boats.
Wow.
Mao is humiliated and the KMT wins the day. That battle in 1949 inevitably leads to a couple of crises in the Taiwan Strait, and the one that we usually focus on is the second Taiwan Strait crisis. So fast forward, it's now 1958, and tensions are growing, and the PLA starts an artillery bombardment of Jinmen that goes on for 44 days. But in the context of this crisis where the PLA and mainland China is once again threatening Taiwan, this is when you hear about MacArthur thinking maybe nuclear weapons would be, maybe atomic weapons would be a good idea because we've signed a treaty alliance with Taiwan in 1951. The U.S. Air Force actually deployed fighters to Taiwan in the second Taiwan Strait crisis. what is it? The F-104 Starfighter, right?
Yep.
So it fits conveniently into heavy lift aircraft of the day. And so we flew those, I think it was Globemasters to Taiwan.
C-124s. And
C-124s and offloaded the F-104s and set up camp there in Taiwan with the U.S. Air Force to communicate to China, hey, not cool, but Jinmen was right there. So that became the thing that they could focus their anger and their angst against as they considered whether it was worth trying to cross the strait or conduct some kind of firepower strike against Taiwan. So the U.S. held the line with our Taiwan allies, but boy, Jinmen took it in the face, right? They were under an intense artillery barrage for about 44 days. And
is this nonstop, or is it
pretty much nonstop?
Wow,
Lots.
that's a lot.
I don't have the numbers here, but it was
a lot of shells.
It was a lot of shells, and then they settled. So it ends in December 1958.
So why does it end?
Well, it doesn't.
How does it come to a conclusion?
This is the thing. It doesn't really end. For 21 years.
What?
For 21 years, the PLA does this eccentric odd, even day. I forget whether it was the odd days or the even days, but like they would only shell on one of the days, and then it would be like no shelling. And like it was like the trenches in World War I, where they just got into this routine of like, okay, today we're shelling, and then the shells would come over and they would shell the island. Statement shelling, and they did that until 1979. That
is shocking.
Yeah, so lots of shelling, but again, Taiwan and Jinmen, for that matter.
No, this isn't just like a tiny little isolated military outpost. Like there's people that actually live on Jinmen, right?
Yeah. And there are military outposts there, and
but it's not the only thing.
We got to tour some of, like they were dug in, right? They had years to prepare since 1949. So they've dug artillery positions into the mountains and into the hills and into the rock. And we're able to resist. The point being, again, as a lesson of history, how would Taiwan survive a firepower strike if all these Chinese missiles were to land in Taiwan?
They've done it before.
Well, it's happened before. And I think, again, one of the takeaways is you really don't know how a population is going to react to being bombed until you start bombing them. And you may be surprised with the outcome. In 1949, the PLA thought they were going to be able to make quick work of Jinmen in 3 days. Jinmen stood up to months of bombardment and then years of bombardment and did not break. And Taiwan resolve held for that entire time. So I wouldn't necessarily write off the Taiwan people.
Ability to resist. So, but do you think they're unified like that right now, or are there? I have to imagine, given how close family relationships are, the economic ties that they have with China, that there are, it's probably more nuanced. It's probably a little bit more complex.
And there are some real complexities with Jinmen especially. There is a ferry that goes between that Chinese city of Xiamen and Jinmen. And there are people who spend holidays and go back and forth because they have family in Xiamen and they have family in Jinmen. It was really interesting. Our drivers they took us to this site where there is a giant speaker that looks out over the water. Mm-hmm. It's actually a bunch of speakers. It's like this 3-story tower that has these loudspeakers built into the tower. And they used to, just like the North Korean, South Korean border, right? They used to broadcast messages to the other side of the water. From that location, you can see the new Xiamen Airport. A lot of the Xiamen Airport is reclaimed land. They took a couple of small islands, and they are actually building land out.
Pretty soon you won't need an airport or a boat. You can just drive across.
You can just drive across, right?
From Xiamen to Jinmen.
So it's getting closer and closer to Xiamen. The communist government in mainland China has already established an administrative area for Jinmen for when it is ultimately reintegrated into the mainland. At least that's their plan. So there is this administrative boundary where they say this is Jinmen County, part of Fujian Province, mainland China. Well, the airport has now been built out so far into the water that the drivers were saying, yeah, if we ever do become part of mainland China, the airport is going to be part of Jinmen and we'll get all the tax revenue. So we're actually okay with that. Anyway.
Interesting.
So So this brings up an interesting part of history that I wanted to touch on, because you were talking about these sort of family ties and whether everybody's going to be unified.
Economic ties.
Yeah.
And
So
all of that, yeah.
so again, going back to the Second World War, like we were just talking about, on the 31st of May, 1945, the U.S. 5th Air Force, consisting of 117 B-24 Liberators, these are heavy bombers, they actually conducted the largest ever air raid on Taiwan. The largest air raid on Taiwan, not Japan, not the French, not the Dutch, not
The U.S.
the United States Air Force. Well, the United States Army Air
Yeah,
Corps.
and why?
Okay, so it's 1945. Japan is occupying Taiwan. We were just talking about Operation Causeway. And we were thinking about invading Formosa. We were thinking about invading Taiwan. But the 5th Air Force conducts this bombing raid, and it's really concentrated on Taipei, what was then called Taihoku. I'm going to get this wrong. Taihoku. Taihoku was the former name of Taipei, that big city in the north. And they conduct this air raid, and it is targeted against Japan, but they didn't have, and Japanese forces, but they didn't have precision-guided munitions.
Yeah,
This
they
is
didn't have
carpet
ISR.
bombing.
Nothing's mensurated.
They're
this
carpet bombing Taipei.
is as good as they can get.
So
yeah.
over 3,000 people killed, the largest number of people killed on Taiwan in any military operation. And so we met with this guy, KJ Chang, and he is the founder of a company called Mizo Games. And he basically built a board game called Raid on Taihoku, which is something that every Taiwanese school student knows about their history. And the premise of the game is that it's set in 1945, and there's this raid on Taihoku, and the point of the game is to work together collaboratively with the other players in the game to overcome obstacles and do things as, you know, the bombing is happening and all of this death and destruction is happening around you. Okay, super interesting. I think they're actually turning it into a movie. We had a happy hour one night, and KJ came with his producer and introduced us, and they're going to make a movie out of this. And you can imagine this,
I mean,
right?
on one hand, I can see like this is good trainings to get people to think about how they could survive and collaborate together to get through PLA attacks. On the other hand, a movie like this could be used to demonize U.S. relations.
Yeah, I think it's more the U.S. bombing is going to be that thing that's happening in the background while the hero of this movie is trying to get the girl and save his family and run around with Japan. That's not the point. The point is KJ has moved on. That was his success from a few years ago. He's now developed a board game called 2045. So it's a play on the, it's 100 years after 1945 and the raid on Taihoku. This game is set in 2045, takes place over a 10-day period, but the backdrop is a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So the students and I and my co-professor went to a conference room where they had the game all set up, and they let us play this game, and they talked to us about it, and they talked to us about why they were doing it. Interestingly, that game, the players are actually pitted against one another. And this was the most interesting thing. So, well, yeah, it's not like you're all trying to collaborate together to get through this terrible ordeal. Mizo Games has now set up this game where you as a player, you are part of a faction. You might be the government, you might be the military, you might be a criminal gang, like a mafia sort of organization.
You might be the PTA.
You might be the arms dealer, or you might be a collaborator, somebody who's collaborating with the PLA.
Oh.
And so right up front, you start to get this idea that maybe Taiwan isn't as unified as everybody thinks they are, standing shoulder to shoulder against the PLA invasion force. That when you put groups under pressure, they will necessarily start to look at their own interests, and they will start competing against one another. Now, this is certainly something that the PLA could exploit, but I think the creators of this game wanted to demonstrate to the players, who are probably mostly going to be Taiwanese, that there are great perils in not having that sort of unified front against an invading force, and that if you start working against each other, while this can all be very entertaining and you want to win the game and things like that, there are social and political undertones and social and political messages that the creators of the game actually had in mind. So it's going to be interesting to see. It's already sold out. It's apparently popular within gaming circles, but it'll be interesting to hear more about that as they get more information and feedback about how that game is going to be played.
And how it's received. So I'm curious, like you've talked about the organizational interest, but what about generational attitudes? Are you seeing any difference between the generational attitudes of older Taiwanese versus the younger Taiwanese?
Yeah, 100%. And it really highlights the political divide that we see in Taiwan right now. So remember, I said the nationalists came over and retreated to Taiwan, and Chiang Kai-shek's party was the KMT. And still is Chiang Kai-shek has long since passed, but the KMT still exists as a political party. So the KMT, while they originally were against the communists, in present day are actually more aligned with Beijing and are more in favor of peaceful unification. They're not for unification, but they certainly are against military resistance.
Okay.
And this gets a little complicated, but the older generation lived under the KMT for so long that the older generation is more aligned with what is really now considered right of center values. That's the KMT. The younger generation is more aligned with the Democratic Progressive Party or the Taiwan People's Party, which is considered left of center.
Okay.
So younger people, DPP, very interested in, if not declaring independence, certainly maintaining independence, de jure independence, whereas the KMT is more aligned with Beijing and not in favor of strong military resistance to mainland China. So this is sort of where they're at on the island. The DPP came to power. Well, I think, again, things that a lot of listeners might not appreciate if they don't know about Taiwan history. Taiwan has only had democratic elections for 30 years. So remember, the KMT and Chiang Kai-shek came over. Taiwan was under martial law until 1987. So from 1949 to 1987, it was one-party rule, martial law. You spoke out against Chiang Kai-shek or you presented yourself as a communist, and you were going straight to a concentration camp on a little island off the Taiwan coast, and it was not going to be a good time. So really, it's only when we were engaging with some of our Taiwan interlocutors, they reminded me that, this whole democracy thing—
It's pretty new.
It's pretty new on Taiwan. So we think of, Taiwan is this flourishing democracy and we have to defend it. Only for the last 30 years. And so right now, the DPP under Tsai Ing-wen, who was the last president for the past 8 years or so before 2024, since 2012, she had pretty good approval ratings. I mean, she was up in the 50, 60% range with the DPP. Now, since 2024, the DPP is still in a coalition government. They're still in charge. But there is a third party, the Taiwan People's Party, and it's evenly split. It's like—
And where would you measure the temperature on the Taiwan People's Party?
So they're looking for what every political party is looking for, which is more political power for them. They looked at an alliance with the KMT, but I think the differences were just too stark. But they really want to try to draw power away from the DPP and are looking to KMT supporters. So it's like 40% DPP, at least in the presidential election, it was 40% DPP, Democratic Progressive Party, and then 30, I don't have the exact numbers, but it's 40% DPP, 30% KMT, and then 30% this new third party that's only been around for the last 6 or 7 years.
Now, are they pro-independence or pro-sovereignty, pro-separation?
Pro-sovereignty would probably be a good way to put it. But underneath all of this, and this kind of gets back to what did I experience when I came in and there were these big PLA exercises going on. This is part of the problem. You hear about these PLA exercises, you see them on the news, just like you would see them on the news if you were in Washington, D.C. What do you see in Taiwan? Absolutely nothing.
So their way of life doesn't change, their daily habits, like zero personal impact.
The power doesn't go out, the air raid sirens don't sound.
You still get your TikToks.
Yes, Facebook is the big thing in Taiwan.
All right.
Facebook is the big thing. You still got your Facebook. You don't have power interruptions. You don't have internet interruptions. You don't see missile contrails flying over the island, putting missiles into these closure areas on the other side of the island. You hear about the Air Force scrambled and
but they don't see any of that.
But they don't see any of that. They don't see any of that. The Patriot batteries are hidden away in caves and bunkers on tops of mountains. So what is the threat? A lot of people, when polled, do not think there will be a conflict with the PLA. So as much as we look at it in the military and we look at it in defense circles and defense think tank circles, a lot of people in Taiwan, it's just not part of their reality. So how do you get political support for a bigger military budget or more? How do you get more support for a military budget? How do you get more support for civil defense? How do you generate interest in those things?
When they don't even think it's a credible threat. So how do they look at the way China and the CCP have dealt with, for example, Hong Kong?
So that is a big issue, and that did make the news when the Communist Party cracked down so hard on the Hong Kong protesters in 2019, 2020 at the beginning of COVID. Yeah, that was a huge deal, and it certainly spoke maybe not to the older generation, but certainly to the younger generation of Taiwanese who have never known they have never known the KMT. They have never known martial law. They're looking at peace and prosperity and democracy and having a voice, and they're thinking, yeah, those promises about two systems, one government that was promised in Taiwan in Hong Kong, that ain't happening. And that, I think, made Beijing a bigger threat than they had thought.
So it sounds like Taiwan's will to fight and resist military coercion from the PLA or an invasion, it could be an issue. I mean, you may or may not have the capabilities, depending on how Taiwan funds their defense, but you also might not have the popular support. But I can't imagine that the U.S. or other countries would stand behind Taiwan if Taiwan wasn't willing to stand up for itself. So how does the Taiwanese government feel about that? What are they doing?
Yeah, so they recognize that they have a problem, and they are trying to do things about that. So they have started, the current DPP government last year started a civil defense program. Now, the first rule about Fight Club is don't talk about Fight Club. So they deliberately presented that to the public as this is civil defense for natural disasters. Taiwan is the land of earthquake and super typhoons, which happen a lot. Haven't had a really bad earthquake for a while. There was an earthquake, I think, right before we arrived, which certainly would have shook up Washington, D.C., but for Taiwan, it was just all the buildings are built to high earthquake standards and the bridges and everything else.
Yeah, well, they live on the Ring of Fire, so.
But earthquakes are a reality. Super typhoons are a reality. So the government started this program of civil defense that really focused on preparedness for natural disasters. What they want to do in 2026, according to some of the folks that we were talking to, is they want to start blending those civil defense exercises with military exercises. And they want to start bringing home the point for the public that civil defense also has to be about military defense, and it has to be done in conjunction with military defense. We actually had a really interesting engagement with something called the Kuma Academy. Kuma is the Taiwanese word for the bear that is indigenous to the island.
Okay.
And so the Kuma Academy was about doing public outreach and educating the public, not just about civil defense, not just about how to evacuate your neighborhood, how to do first aid, how to do some of the triage on a rescue for a collapsed building, but also how to have good internet hygiene and how to protect yourself online and how to recognize disinformation and the PLA campaigns that might otherwise divide a society. So that was a really interesting engagement. But I think whether it's
that sounds like some education that we could take.
So, they're engaging with people from Ukraine. They had a Ukrainian flag in their office where they had gone to Ukraine and all the Ukrainians had signed the flag for them because they're looking at Ukraine and they're trying to take those lessons learned and figure out, how do you stand up to military coercion? How does your population deal with something when they're under attack? And how do you resist, and how do you best prepare for those things? And again, I think it goes back to those historical lessons that we were talking about before. You never know how a population is going to react until it actually happens. But I think a lot of folks in Taiwan government and in Taiwan society are trying to do the best they can to prepare for what everybody hopes will never happen.
So what about their military capabilities? Do they have what they need to resist and fight against the PLA? And are they investing in the right kind of capabilities to stand up against China?
Yeah, so a net assessment is difficult. Again, the terrain favors the defender. There are lots of just topography and geography and things that the PLA would have to overcome. But, the answer is it depends. I think in some of the other war games that we played while we were on the island, the premise was Taiwan has to survive for a period of time.
Until somebody comes to their rescue.
Until
the
somebody
U.S. comes to their rescue, other allies come to their rescue.
And in the absence of that support, there are real questions about whether Taiwan can resist. Now, again, blast from the past. We talked about those starfighters going to Taiwan and how the second Strait crisis went in the 1950s. I think the People's Republic of China and Beijing are looking at what's happening in Ukraine, and their takeaway is, the United States will do the exact same thing in Taiwan in 2027 that they did in Ukraine in 2022 or in Taiwan in 1958, which is, we will provide all the weapons, you guys do all the fighting. So Taiwan is not Ukraine. There is no Polish border. There is no land border for all those things to come across. But arguably what the United States is doing in Ukraine, funneling weapons so that the Ukrainians can put up their own defense, that's what we did in 1958 in Taiwan. And I think China's wondering if we might try something like that again.
And my own editorial is we did not provide enough or the right kind of weapons to Ukraine. We just gave them just enough.
Just enough to defend, not enough to win.
Yeah.
So we did have some really interesting engagements when we were in Taiwan. We met with a company called TT Robotics. They actually, I want to say it's like Turbo Tiger, but they make like remote control race cars. And they have now transitioned to TT Robotics and spun off this company called TT Robotics that is making military-grade drones.
Okay.
Small drones, large drones, unmanned surface vehicles for maritime engagements. And so, again, lessons learned from Ukraine. Hey, precision artillery is one thing, but precision artillery as drones is something else. It's not going to get you that air superiority, but it could come in super handy if you're trying to swarm a beach and pick off, select vehicles, select armored vehicles and things. I asked him in the course of our discussion, I said, so you're automating this factory, you're building all these small drones. What kind of capacity are you looking at? How many drones can you produce? And his response was 4,000. And I said, 4,000 a year, that's a lot of drones. And he's like, no, 4,000 a month. So they've gotten the message. It's going to take volume. They may be small, but they are mighty. If you can push 4,000 drones a month out of your production line, you can create those effects in the battle space close to Taiwan.
Yeah, because those little drones, we know that they are essentially consumables. They're not going to be reusing them over and over again like you would a fighter. You basically have to treat them as if they're munitions when it comes to your inventory. So the only question that I would have for them is, talk to me about your supply chain, your raw materials, and where you're sourcing your parts.
Exactly.
Are they coming from China?
No. In fact, they called it the non-red, I think it translated to non-red supply chain. And non-red supply chain means no part of your supply chain can come from China.
Smart.
So the batteries come from Korea, the electronics come from Japan. A lot of, Taiwan makes a lot of the chips for the world.
Oh, yeah.
So they have a lot of indigenously sourced things. Now, there were questions about like, okay, your batteries come from Korea, but where did the lithium come from that goes into the Korean batteries? Did that come from China? And they're like, we can only track the supply chain so far.
Yeah.
We can't necessarily go all the way back, but they are certainly, in terms of first order effects, looking at non-red supply chains for all of their military
first and
hardware.
second-tier suppliers.
We had another interesting engagement with the Taiwan Shipbuilding Corporation, which is still technically the China Shipbuilding Corporation because it is the Republic of China. So CSBC, and they have built a prototype of an unmanned surface vehicle that is much more substantial, that has a much longer range, that could actually get as far as the Chinese coast and engage there. So again, they are still focusing on large manned systems. They're purchasing F-16s. Those were part of the $11 billion arms deal that the U.S. just announced in December of 2025. They do want to, the China Shipbuilding Corporation or Taiwan Shipbuilding Corporation is involved in their manned submarine program, and there's a lot of controversy over whether these big, prestigious manned systems are what Taiwan needs, or do they just need a slew of unmanned systems that can swarm the battle space and deliver that sort of hellscape that Admiral Paparo talks about as the commander of Indo-PACOM.
JDAM, this has been a great conversation, and I know that we're going to want to have you back, but we got to wrap this up. So one last question. What was the coolest thing that you experienced on your trip to Taiwan?
So the coolest thing, and you and I have already talked about this, so you know what the answer is.
I know it's on my Christmas list.
The coolest thing was Master Wu's knives. And so this, you can find them on,
like QVC.
You can find them online, maestrowu.com. So Master Wu is a metal worker on the island of Jinmen. So in the 1930s, he starts picking up bomb fragments, again, from U.S. bombing of
This guy's got to be older than dirt.
He's pretty old. And he's got a lot of apprentices now and things. But anyway, so what his deal was is after the 1958 bombardment of Jinmen, there are all of these shells around the island. And then for 20 years, they're shelling the island. Now, we talk about this like, are all of these explosive shells? And they were not. Some of these were leaflet shells. And
Propaganda.
The propaganda, and these were particularly useful to Master Wu because what it is it's a shell that has like a cylinder inside, and there are this sort of metal sheathing that at some point in the shell's trajectory it will pop the cylinder out, and then these paper leaflets will come out with propaganda and things like that. Well, these things are littering the island of Jinmen. And Master Wu says, this is an opportunity. I'm going to make knives out of these artillery shells and these metal sheaths that pop out of the shells. He's got all this material, high-grade steel. He's going to turn them into knives. And so we got to go to his shop, and we can put a picture online with the show notes. But he's got all these artillery shells, and he is literally hammering these things into cutlery. And so the students and I and Professor Peck, we spent, I don't know, we probably spent 90 minutes in Master Wu's shop, and I think we dropped several $1,000s on knives. And of course, none of those could go in your carry-on, so you better have room in your checked luggage. But that was one of the coolest things that we saw there in Taiwan. But it was a fantastic trip, and again, shout out to Dan Peck. He was the brains behind it, and I cannot say enough about how he orchestrated that class. And I learned a lot, and I was just happy to be along.
Well, we were happy to have you go. Keep those relationships warm, see the island again. You're going to go on a trip to Japan here soon, and we'll come back and have a conversation about how that goes as well. But always great conversation. Thanks, JDAM.
Thanks for having me, Heather.
And with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's conversation. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button or follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas that you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on X, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great Aerospace Power kind of day. See you next time.
And then we could wrap talking about Master Wu and his knives.
Ginsu knives. Wu knives.
Wu knives.
Wu knives.
Wu knives.
You know, and when you told us that story, suddenly every Mitchellier was like, I know what I want from JDAM for Christmas.
Christmas is a long ways away, Heather. Perhaps there is another occasion for which you would like a knife.
There are many occasions in which I would like a knife.
So a knife is actually not a good gift to give in Chinese culture because it means you're cutting ties.
Really?
Shane's nodding.
Interesting.
You don't give a clock either because it means you're running down the clock on your relationship.
Really?
Yeah. Clocks and knives, not good gifts.
So don't give someone a wristwatch.
With a pocket knife inside of it, no.
That's interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah.